This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Be advised that the views and opinions of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
This is another week in the Asian century, and a century is roughly 365 or 36,500 days. I computed it, and this is the past 7 days of the 36,000 plus more days to come of the Asian century, led by China and of course ASEAN, India, and the other countries in our region. And what is the significant person this week? In what place? Well, we have our exclusive scoop interview with our man in China. Our man meaning the Philippines man in China, Ambassador Jose Santiago, Chito Sta Romana. It was a scoop because we had the privilege to be tipped off about the ambassador's arrival in Manila for a week of quiet rest, and I was given the privilege of interviewing him. It was just 7 months ago that Ambassador Santa Romana officially assumed the Beijing assignment and office, and it has been a sea change that we have seen in the relations between the Philippines and China, and literally a sea change in the environment of the China Sea and the West Philippine Sea, all for the better, and a great deal better at that. The latest survey done by the American polling group Pew Research reports that 55% of Filipinos now view China in a positive light. Compare that to negative 30 in the year 2012. And Ambassador Chito Sta Romana, taking the cue from President Rodrigo Roa Duterte's lead in the independent foreign policy and pivot to China, has done a marvelous job in Beijing in enhancing the diplomatic achievement of the current administration. Here in this first segment, we asked Ambassador Santa Romana for an update in the Philippine-China engagement. Let's watch this.
Well, the state of bilateral relations is certainly on the upswing, and the relations have been developing quite fast and developing in a positive direction. So I think the outlook is quite good in terms of more positive developments that will crop up. But challenges, of course, remain. And the key, however, I think is that what is happening is that both sides are able to talk about their differences in a diplomatic and peaceful way, and at the same time are able to focus on the areas of cooperation, whether anti-terrorism or development or trade, investments and development assistance, infrastructure. And so by approaching it in this way and by not putting the disputes at the center, but rather distinguishing between what are non-contentious from the contentious issues, we're able to proceed quite fast in promoting the relations between the two countries. Public opinion has always been an important variable in handling this, and the President has actually, in a sense, made a far-sighted decision because, in a sense, there was a lot of distrust of China. What is happening, though, and to a great extent, it depends on China's conduct. The Chinese reassurance so far has been matched with their action. They have publicly reassured the Philippines that they will keep Scarborough Shoal as a fishing ground, as a marine preserve, and that's why we're able to regain access. That they will not reclaim it or that they will not build any installation on it. Also, that they will respect the Philippine sovereign rights over the Benham rice or the Philippine rice. In the same manner, the former blockade of Ayungin Shoal that has been lifted, and so the supply lines are proceeding. And the same is true with Pag-asa and the areas that the maritime features that are occupied by the Philippines, the supply lines are now open. The recent incident over Sandy Cay, which became a big controversy here, has been resolved through diplomatic means at a high level. And basically the two sides have agreed, to keep it unoccupied and to let it be, in a sense, to observe how the situation can be done and to avoid a naval or maritime standoff there, and to resolve the differences through diplomatic channels.
Well, these diplomatic channels have been enhanced very positively. How has this enhanced friendly and cooperative relationship between the Philippines and China been achieved despite the constant crying wolf of a few but very vociferous and alarmist elements in the Philippines? Running to media with scare stories about China planting flags in the disputed islands or shoals, or sailing ships here and there that turn out to be false alarms. What positive changes has come about in the past 7 months for the Philippines that Ambassador Santa Romana has worked day in and day out in our Beijing embassy to help bring about? What are the steps that have been taken to ensure that all these continue their beneficial progression in the months and years ahead? In this second segment, Ambassador Chito Sta gives further details on the multifarious and complex arrangements and agreements that have made all the improvements possible and durable. Let's watch.
I think the key really is, first, as the saying in diplomacy goes, trust and verify. You take the Chinese, or you take the Philippines and the Chinese, the relationship on its word, what you discuss, what you negotiate on, and then you try to verify through actual monitoring. You have to see if what you have agreed upon is being followed on the ground or on the waters. So in this case, the flag actually was not on Sandy Cay, but in another atoll that is quite far, that is some distance from the Pag-asa, and it turned out it was not a flag. It was like a certain for marker, and a marker for mariners. But the point is this: the key, I think, is that whatever is under our control, we will not give up on, and we haven't lost anything over the past year since the administration has taken over. As a matter of fact, we have regained access to Scarborough Shoal. We have regained the supply lines, the freedom of supply to Ayungin. We have regained, in a sense, no more harassment in supplying our forces in Pag-asa. So, and basically, we have managed, I think, to diffuse the escalating tensions that was existing before, and we are now trying to turn it into a cycle, a benign cycle of goodwill begetting more goodwill, of one positive gesture begetting another positive gesture. There will always be challenges because the basic issue, the territorial dispute, has not been resolved, neither by the arbitral tribunal nor through. We had one session of the bilateral consultative mechanism. There will be another one in December. The key, though, is that there is a forum where we can discuss the delicate issues, the contentious issues, the sensitive issues. And so the underlying issue, who owns Scarborough, who owns the Spratlys, this and the interpretation, of the arbitral tribunal, whether to comply with it or not. The Chinese have their different position. These are the differences that we discuss in this bilateral mechanism or through a high-level diplomacy. There is a standoff. We have different views. But at least there is a mutual agreement to handle this one by one and to discuss this peacefully and diplomatically.
In this third segment, Ambassador Santa Romana, which will follow, goes to the item that holds a big payoff for the Philippine-China engagement. Cooperation in many fields of endeavor, but specifically in the economic exploration and development of the common, or in quotes, shared areas, which may yield a windfall for the Philippines as well as its partners, which is not just necessarily China, but also Malaysia and other claimants, depending on the areas and arrangements involved. What are the challenges ahead to allow these promising direction to come to fruition? Ambassador Chito Santa Romana explains the complex tasks ahead, and Ambassador Santa Romana finally raises the fundamental importance of what he calls strategic patience in negotiations, in dialogue, and in achieving, therefore, constructive results from the contentious disputes, and cites the experience of Russia and Vietnam with China over the decades.
The issue of how, you see, what we basically have is that on the issue of the West Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, we have several neighboring countries. And the question really is how to approach it so that you could share the fishery resources, the gas and oil resources. Of course, there's the issue of sovereignty and the issue of sovereign rights. So that's why it's a challenging issue. On the issue of the West Philippine Sea, the most immediate issue, according to the Energy Secretary, Cusi, is he wants to lift the moratorium that was imposed about 2 years ago as a result of the arbitration case. Before there was a moratorium, and going back to more than 10 years, there was already an agreement on one of the service area very near Malampaya and very close to Palawan. That was not a contentious area, where the Chinese, the National Offshore Oil Company, actually acknowledged Philippine sovereignty and agreed to invest, and they paid money already, and they're willing to operationalize it. The question, however, was because of the moratorium, this has been set aside. So the discussions now are first on whether to lift the moratorium and how to go about it. The bigger issue of the recto bank, how to deal with it, is much more sensitive, and that's why it entails much more research, much more study, and that's why we're proceeding cautiously. But both sides, I think, recognize that there must be a formula that is in accord with Philippine Constitution and also acceptable to the Chinese, that will allow us to have a joint undertaking or a joint exploration, whatever you call it. The Japanese before tried it with China, and it goes back to 2008. And somehow, because of subsequent problems, it didn't work. Now, in the Philippines, what is going to our advantage is that the political atmosphere has improved, and the element of mutual confidence is there. So the key, though, is how to be able to overcome the legal obstacles so that we could proceed. And this will be something that will be a continuing topic in the coming months. I think, in a sense, it's much more pressing for the Philippines because Malampaya is going to run out, and so we want to develop recto bank. The basic issue really here is how to do it in such a way that will be in line with our sovereign rights, in line with our Constitution. But I think it will be, otherwise it will be the subject, it will be a divisive subject. It has been in the past, and it continues to be. So this is the challenge for the policymakers on both sides. It's how to transcend the differences and yet find a way that will be acceptable to the public of both sides. You see, the basic choice is whether you proceed with an adversarial position, a confrontational position, whether you put the dispute at the center and therefore an obstacle that unless the disputes are settled, you cannot improve relations, or whether you find a way to put the dispute, to discuss the dispute in a peaceful and diplomatic way, and to separate it, compartmentalize it from the non-contentious issues which were affected before, like trade, commerce, investment, infrastructure, education, science, culture. There's a whole range that is now able to be put on a fast track because they are non-contentious. There is no issue involved. As for the contentious issues, I think both sides have realized that it will take time. You know, the issue of solving the question of sovereignty is a very sensitive issue, and it usually takes years, if not decades, to resolve this. The Soviets, and eventually the Russians and the Chinese, they went through a period of, you know, border clashes and mutual threats of war, hostilities. And then they finally went back to the negotiating table, and took them from the very start, almost 4 decades, to the period of the time the Soviet Union collapsed, at least another decade of negotiations. The Vietnamese went through the same thing. And these are the two countries with the most recent experience of resolving disputes with China. In the case of Vietnam, they went through, you know, a period also of border war. And then eventually, when the Soviet Union collapsed and there was no backer anymore. So the point I'm making is that it will take a period of time. That's why you need strategic patience in dealing with the sovereignty issue. The key is that you're able to continue discussing it, but you don't put it on the center and make it an obstacle. Then you can find an opening. Otherwise, the relations will stay frozen through the decades.
It was an enlightening talk with the Philippine ambassador to China, Jose Santiago. This is just part of our interview with our man in Beijing. Next week, we will bring you part 2 and more interesting insights from our man in Beijing.